There is a belief most Americans carry into retirement that costs them more than any bad investment ever could. Not a belief about markets. Not a belief about timing. A belief about what went wrong. The portfolio that shrank when it should have grown. The savings that bought less every year without any single dramatic event causing it. The retirement number that arrived smaller than the statements promised and has been shrinking faster than expected ever since. Most Americans explain that outcome one of two ways. Either the advisor did not know enough to prevent it, or the market simply did not cooperate with the plan. Both explanations are wrong. And holding either one means the same outcome continues across the years remaining. Because neither explanation locates the cause in the right place. The cause was never the advisor's knowledge. It was never the market cycle. It was architecture. A specific set of structural decisions made by institutions that understood exactly what those decisions would cost the families following their advice. Saudi dynastic families know this not because they studied it from the outside. Because they were on the other side of it. They watched the architecture get built. They watched it get recommended to an entire generation of American savers. And they watched the outcomes it produced while their own families operated inside a completely different set of rules. 10 of those rules. Starting with the one most Americans have been living inside without knowing it had a name. If this channel is giving you what those institutions never did, subscribe. What comes next is the explanation that should have arrived 30 years ago. Truth 1, your savings account is a transfer machine. Every dollar sitting in a savings account earning below inflation interest is moving in one direction. Away from the family that deposited it. Toward the institution holding it. The bank lends that deposit at a rate exceeding what it pays back by a margin that has made American banking consistently profitable for 50 consecutive years. The depositor receives the appearance of safety. The bank receives the productive use of the depositor's capital. A retired accountant in Georgia kept $400,000 in a savings account for 11 years because his advisor called it liquidity. The account averaged 1.2% annually. Inflation averaged 4.1% across the same period. He lost purchasing power every single year. Not to a market crash. To a savings account his advisor called safe. Saudi families use savings accounts as waiting rooms. Temporary positions for capital in transit toward assets that actually preserve purchasing power. The money does not stay. It moves. The savings account is not the destination. Most Americans were told it was. Truth 2, diversification is a fee generation strategy. A portfolio diversified across managed equity funds, managed bond funds, managed alternatives, and managed international exposure requires ongoing management across every single category. Every category generates ongoing fees. The diversification that feels like protection is simultaneously the architecture that maximizes advisory revenue from the family's assets. Saudi families concentrate across 3 unmanaged categories. Physical hard assets. Income-producing assets outside the banking system. Liquid reserves outside concentrated deposits. None require a manager. None generate advisory fees. None exist inside the system that profits from keeping assets under management. The diversification most Americans followed was designed around the advisory system's revenue model first. Family wealth preservation second. Those two objectives are not the same. For 50 years they were presented as if they were. Truth 3, your home equity is the bank's most patient asset. Every product designed to help a family access home equity is built around one structural reality. The bank's ownership position in the underlying asset grows every time the family uses it. Reverse mortgages. Home equity lines of credit. Cash out refinancing. A couple in Florida spent 31 years building $340,000 in home equity. They took a reverse mortgage at retirement. 16 years later the bank held the majority equity position in the property. The children inherited a legal process. Not an asset. The bank understood that trajectory at the moment of signing. The family understood it only when the transfer was complete. Saudi families treat home equity as a hard asset equivalent. Not liquidity to be accessed. Ownership to be preserved and transferred intact. Truth 4, the 4% withdrawal rule will fail this generation. The 4% rule was designed inside an interest rate and inflation environment that no longer exists. It assumes a managed portfolio can sustain indefinite withdrawals without exhausting itself across a standard retirement horizon. That assumption has failed visibly for the generation that followed it most faithfully. Because the inflation and volatility environment of the last 15 years combined to deplete portfolios faster than the rule projected. Saudi families never built retirement income around liquidating a portfolio. They built it around assets that generate income without being consumed. Rental properties producing monthly cash flow. Energy royalty instruments paying quarterly distributions. A liquidating portfolio gets smaller every time income is drawn from it. An income-producing asset continues generating regardless of how long the income has been drawn. The family drawing income from assets that are not being consumed cannot outlive their wealth. The family drawing down a portfolio increasingly can. Truth 5. Inflation is a policy decision, not a weather event. Most Americans experience inflation the way they experience weather. A force without an author. A condition to be endured. That framing was built deliberately by the institutions that create and manage the monetary conditions producing inflation. Inflation has an author. It has a mechanism. Every dollar of inflation moves real purchasing power from the person who saved to the institution that borrowed. The Federal Reserve manages that mechanism. Saudi families treat every inflation signal as an instruction. Not as weather to endure. As a trigger that initiates a specific sequence of moves. Converting cash to physical gold. Accelerating land acquisition. Moving savings into commodity-linked income. Eliminating dollar-denominated debt. The viewer feeling inflation in their grocery bill right now is receiving the same signal Saudi families have been trained across generations to act on immediately. The difference between acting on the signal and enduring it is the difference between the two outcomes this channel exists to explain. If this channel is giving you what those institutions never did, subscribe. 5 more truths. They go deeper. Truth 6. Your advisor's incentive is continuation, not performance. The commission-based advisory relationship has one structural characteristic that remains constant regardless of portfolio performance. The fee continues. Whether the portfolio grew or shrank. Whether the recommendations outperformed or underperformed a passive index. The annual management percentage was extracted from the asset column every year without exception. A retiree with $500,000 in a managed account paying 1% annually paid $100,000 across 20 years for advice that statistically underperforms passive index performance after fees. The advisor's income was guaranteed throughout. The client's outcome was not. Saudi families pay flat fees for defined work with defined endpoints. The work completes. The payment stops. The decision returns to the family. No ongoing percentage. No relationship structured to continue indefinitely regardless of outcomes. That distinction, guaranteed income for the advisor, uncertain outcome for the client, is the structural reality of the commission-based relationship. It was normalized so completely that questioning it became socially unusual. Saudi families never normalized it. Truth 7. Paper gold is not gold. A gold ETF and a gold coin held in personal possession share one characteristic. They both move when gold prices move. They share nothing else that matters when gold protection matters most. A gold ETF is a financial instrument held by an institution inside the banking system. During genuine financial stress, the exact conditions when gold protection is most needed, that institution is subject to the same systemic pressures creating the stress. Physical gold held personally exists outside every institutional risk simultaneously. It cannot be frozen. It cannot be subject to institutional bail-ins. It cannot lose value because the bank managing the paper instrument made poor decisions somewhere else. Saudi families hold the physical asset, not the promise layered on top of it. American advisors recommended paper gold because paper gold sits inside a managed account and generates fees. Physical gold held personally generates nothing for an advisor. Which is precisely why the distinction between the two was never explained clearly to the people who needed to understand it most. Truth 8. Debt is not a wealth-building tool. American financial culture taught an entire generation that inflation benefits borrowers. Borrow now. Let inflation erode the real cost of the obligation. Emerge with hard assets and reduce debt burden simultaneously. That logic contains a flaw old money families recognized long before it became popular advice. It assumes the borrower remains in control of their assets throughout the entire inflationary period. It does not account for what happens when inflationary volatility puts pressure on leveraged positions precisely when they are most vulnerable. Saudi families eliminate dollar-denominated debt the moment inflation signals appear. Not because the theoretical argument is entirely wrong, Because they have watched what happens to families holding hard assets inside leveraged positions during volatile periods. If cash flow pressure requires selling the asset at the worst possible moment, the debt has not just cost its stated interest rate. It has cost the difference between the distressed sale price and the price that patients would have produced. That difference is permanent. Old money uses inflation as a signal to eliminate every obligation that could force an involuntary asset sale. Not as a borrowing opportunity. Truth 9. Equal partnerships are paralysis structures. Saudi families do not enter 50-50 ownership partnerships. Not because they distrust partners. Because equal ownership without defined decision authority creates a structural problem that only becomes visible during the moments when fast decisions determine outcomes. A 50-50 partnership requires both partners to agree on every significant decision. During stable periods, that creates no friction. During volatile periods, when an asset needs to be sold quickly, when an opportunity requires immediate capital deployment, the requirement for mutual agreement becomes the mechanism that prevents action at the exact moment action matters most. Saudi families structure every partnership with explicit decision authority frameworks before the partnership begins. Who controls which decisions? What happens when partners disagree? How the partnership exits without requiring mutual agreement on terms? These questions are answered before the partnership forms. Not during the crisis that reveals why they needed answering. Equal ownership without hierarchy is not partnership. It is a structure waiting for disagreement to reveal its flaw. And disagreement always arrives at the worst possible moment. Truth 10. Generational wealth is lost at the transfer point. The families that built meaningful wealth and lost it were not destroyed by bad investments during the accumulating generation. They were destroyed at the transition. Estate taxes. Probate costs. Assets held as a unified block during accumulation fragmenting across multiple heirs with multiple priorities and no shared structure for preserving what was transferred. A lifetime of discipline building surrendered across a single legal process the family never prepared for. Saudi families treat the transfer structure as equally important as the assets it holds. The formal architecture, family trust, holding structures, defined transfer mechanisms, is built during the decades of accumulation when it can be designed with care. Not assembled under pressure after the event requiring it has already arrived. American estate attorneys know how to build these structures. They simply almost never volunteer the complete picture to families who do not already know what questions to ask. Saudi families know what questions to ask because the answers were passed down as explicitly as the assets themselves. The structure is considered as important as what it holds. Because a family that builds physical gold, land, and income-producing assets across a lifetime and loses 40% of it in a single generational transition did not actually preserve wealth. They preserved it for one generation. And surrendered it to a system that was waiting at the transfer point. 10 truths. One principle underneath all of them. The outcomes most Americans experience across their financial lives were not produced by bad luck or market cycles or insufficient income. They were produced by architecture. Specific structural decisions made by institutions that understood exactly what those decisions would cost the families following their advice. Saudi dynastic families operated inside a different architecture during the same 50 years. Not because they had access to different markets or different instruments. Because they understood what the institutions recommending the first architecture had a financial reason to obscure. These 10 truths were available the entire time. In the structure of the instruments being sold. In the fee disclosures buried in documents nobody read carefully enough. In the logic of a system that earned more when its clients held more inside it. They were simply never explained by anyone with an incentive to explain them. That is not a conspiracy. It is a business model. And it operated without interruption for 50 years while an entire generation of American savers followed the allocation their advisors recommended and arrived at retirement with a number smaller than it should have been and shrinking faster than they expected. The architecture can be changed. It can only be changed once it is understood. If this channel is giving you what those institutions never did, subscribe. There is significantly more coming.